For most of history, human life wasn't protected. It was merely tolerated. Existing meant walking through a world where nothing was safe, where death didn't arrive only in wars or grand tragedies, but hid inside the simplest routines, the most innocent gestures, the most basic needs. The past wasn't some distant backdrop. It was a brutal place, where surviving meant distrusting even what seemed essential, because there was a time when survival itself was a silent roulette wheel. You needed luck. Luck breathing the air of a filthy street. Luck eating a piece of bread. Luck touching a doorknob, sleeping in a damp room. And above all, luck doing something that today feels almost sacred because it's so absurdly normal. Drinking water. A simple sip, something that today represents life, purity, normality. Back then was a gamble against the invisible, an everyday gesture that could open the door to illness, fevers, epidemics, and sudden disappearances. Water wasn't just water, it was liquid threat. A transparent danger flowing through the cities of the 19th century. And it's to that world dark, fragile, and merciless that we now return. And among all the dangers surrounding existence in that century, hunger, cold, exhausting labor, violent streets, and misery spread like dusts, there was an enemy even crueler, because it was invisible, ordinary, and unavoidable. You couldn't run from it. You couldn't completely escape it. It was inside homes, in markets, in alleys, in public barrels, in shared wells. The danger came disguised as necessity, a crystal-clear game of Russian roulette. A risk swallowed every day by millions of people who had no alternative. Each sip could kill slowly. Each jug could carry a sentence. And the most terrifying part was that no one could see what was inside. Cities were growing. Modernity seemed to be dawning. But beneath the promises of progress, daily life was poised. And to understand how what are the most essential elements of life became one of the greatest vehicles of death in the 19th century, we need to walk through the dark streets of that time. We need to return to a place where danger wasn't the exception. It was routine. We are in the middle of the 19th century. The year is 1850, and the world is changing too fast for human life to keep up. The great cities of Europe and America are swelling like feverish organisms, bloated, noisy, suffocating. London, Paris, New York, names that today evoke culture and grandeur, but back then were labyrinths of smoke, sewage, and tightly packed crowds. The industrial century is marching forward. Factories swallow men before dawn. Chimneys paint the sky gray. Narrow streets echo hurried footsteps over mud mixed with filth, animal remains, and garbage. The modern city is being born, but it is born dirty, sick, improvised. And at the center of this new urban life is a need impossible to ignore. Water, not for comfort, but for existence. To drink, to cook, to survive. Except this water doesn't come from safe taps, filtered systems, or clean underground networks. It comes from shallow wells dug beside cesspits, from rivers where waste is dumped, from public reservoirs touched by hundreds of hands. And no one fully understands what is happening. Big, because science still cannot see the enemy. Danger travels inside something that looks pure. The stage is set. Overcrowded cities, non-existent infrastructure, crushing poverty, and an essential liquid carrying invisible death. And it is in this world, where progress lives side by side with rot, that drinking water becomes a fatal game. The reason for this Russian roulette wasn't a moral mystery. It was a historical machine. The first was uncontrolled urban growth. Entire neighborhoods rose in weeks, built to house factory labor, with no drainage, no regular waste collection. No space for anything that didn't turn a profit. Now the second was open sewage shallow pits, ditches, canals, and buckets dumped into the streets, where the city poured everything the human body and slaughterhouses produced. The third was water collected without protection. The fourth was scientific blindness. Before microbes became accepted reality, people blamed miasmas, bad air, punishment, bad luck, almost any explanation except the right one. These pillars didn't act separately. They leaned into each other, fed each other, and squeezed everyday life like a vice. Rain pushed filth into the sources. Gaze. Overcrowding shortened the distance between sick bodies and healthy ones. And poverty slammed the final door shut. There was no choice, only necessity. Drinking was mandatory. And in that world, the mandatory could be deadly. Even when someone suspected the metallic taste or the murky water, boiling required coal, time, pots rare, luxuries. Buying better water meant paying extra for something that might still have come from the same river, and carrying clean water, when it existed at all, meant hauling weight up narrow staircases, through crowded corridors, across courtyards where the ground never dried. So the city created a brutal equation. The more people arrived, the more waste piled up. The more waste, the sicker the water became. The sicker the water, the weaker the population that kept the city running. It was a closed cycle, spinning day after day, like a machine with no off switch, and then everyday life did the rest. Nothing began as a tragedy. It began small. A bucket going down a dark staircase, a child carrying a glass to her mother, a vendor filling barrels at the edge of a murky river. Life went on, because it had to. Thirst didn't wait, and in every simple gesture, the city pushed another domino into motion. Early in the morning, working-class neighborhoods woke up smelling of burnt coal and old urine. The streets narrow and muddy received the night's offerings. Buckets hurled from windows, scraps of food, butcher's blood. Stale rainwater mixed it all together, dragging filth toward the very same places where people fetched drinking water. The wells looked sturdy, deep, trustworthy. But underground, the cesspits leaked slowly, poisoning the soil like an invisible toxin. The hands that touched coins also touched mugs, communal taps, well pumps. Every contact was a link in a chain. And no one saw it. No one knew. The water looked clear enough. Danger had no color. Inside the homes, space was too tight for the number of bodies. Damp rooms, shared mattresses, walls stained with mold. A jug of water passed from hand to hand. The same cup, the same thirst, because illness didn't arrive like thunder. It seeped in. First, the fever. Then cramps, weakness, brutal dehydration. Bodies folded over in makeshift beds while outside the city kept working, ignoring the warning. The wagons still rolled by. The factories still whistled. But inside the houses, families realized something was wrong. And when the domino finally fell, it fell in waves. One case became 10. 10 became 100. Within days, powerless doctors spoke of an outbreak. Within weeks, people whispered plague. And the water, the same water everyone needed, kept being swallowed because there was no alternative. Every sit was a bet. Every bet fed the next collapse. That's how an industrial city, built on haste and misery, turned thirst into a sentence. And while modernity raised its buildings and machines, and at the center of it all were not numbers, not statistics. They were people, ordinary people, crushed by a danger they didn't understand and couldn't escape. The human cost wasn't abstract. It had a face. It had names whispered in stifling rooms. It had the sound of a mother calling a child who would never answer again. Apatico workers were the first to fall. Hurley, holding up industrial empires with their own bodies, returned home already weak, already exhausted only to find in the water their final blow. The disease struck fast. One day they were standing, the next they were motionless, skin cold, eyes hollow, as if life itself had been drained away with every lost drop. Women tried to keep the household standing while everything collapsed. Fear was constant, because no one knew which cup had been the wrong one. And the children. The children were always the most vulnerable, too small to resist, too small to understand. They fell ill first, dehydrated faster, vanished before the next dawn arrived. In poor neighborhoods, child death was so frequent that grief blended into routine. Carts carried bodies through the streets as part of daily life. Hospitals, when they existed, overflowed. Cemeteries expanded like scars. Priests repeated the same prayers. Doctors, without answers, spoke of bad luck, poisoned air, punishment. And families, with no choice, kept drinking. Because the greatest terror wasn't only the disease, it was the inevitability. 'Twas knowing it could happen again tomorrow, that the next cup could be the next sentence. So watered, the universal symbol of life, became the most intimate channel of tragedy, a domestic enemy, a transparent assassin sitting at the table every day, in front of millions of people who only wanted to keep existing. To live in that world was to inhabit a city that never seemed clean. Yet, the day began with the metallic sound of factories waking before the sun, and ended with streets still wet, still filthy, still carrying remnants that never truly vanished. Its life was physical, thick, visceral. Everything had a smell. Everything left a stain. Everything felt too close. In poor neighborhoods, water was fetched the way one fetches fire, with urgency and danger. Women crossed narrow corridors, carrying heavy buckets, dripping down the steps. Children waited in lines around public pumps, watching the hand turn the lever, hearing the gush that sounded like hope. But hope had a strange taste, sometimes metallic, sometimes bitter, sometimes just lukewarm, as if the liquid had been sitting too long somewhere unseen. Homes were damp. Walls breathed mold. The floor was always cold, always sticky. The air carried cold smoke mixed with latrine stench. People slept to the sound of coughing all around, bodies stacked in narrow beds. And in the corner of the room a jug of water sat quietly, like something ordinary, and yet deeply threatening. Food wasn't separate from the environment. Hard bread, watery soups, scraps bought at the end of the market. Everything was touched by dirty hands, insects, contaminated surfaces, and water entered everything into tea, into children's porridge, into the preparation of the few vegetables available. Even when boiled, it wasn't always enough. Carts groaned over stained stones. Horses left droppings wherever they went. Butcher shops dumped blood into open runoff. People walked in worn boots, stepping around puddles that weren't just rainwater. At night, weak lanterns lit alleys where rats ran freely, where children played near heaps of garbage, where sewage was simply part of the scenery. Tash, the understanding that sickness was part of the contract of existing. When someone began to fall ill, neighbors didn't ask why, they asked who's next. Fever was familiar. Diarrhea was familiar. Funerals were familiar. The experience was sensory because it was total. Skin felt the grime. The stomach felt the uncertainty, the throat felt the thirst, and thirst ruled everything. Drinking was mandatory. Even doubting, even fearing, people drank. In wealthy districts, the scene was different, almost another planet within the same city. Mansions had servants to fetch better water, imported drinks, physical distance from filth. Streets were wider, air less suffocating, death less frequent. But even there, danger could cross the border. Because epidemics didn't respect curtains. Contaminated water didn't choose victims by morality, only by exposure. That was the urban 19th century, a world where progress walked hand in hand with rot, where machines created the future, but water carried the past, where survival meant enduring a daily life soaked in threat, and where every sip, simple and unavoidable, was a brutal reminder that life could end not with an explosion, but with silence. And still, people woke up the next day, still fetched water, still insisted on living inside the roulette wheel. Within that same city, there were worlds that never truly touched, separated by only a few streets, a couple of walls, an almost invisible distance. Rich and poor lived completely different realities in the face of the same danger. Water, which for some was a constant threat, for others was just another manageable detail. In elegant neighborhoods, filth seemed farther away. There were servants to obtain better supply, coal to boil, time to wait, resources to avoid public sources. When they fell ill, they called doctors. When they feared, they had options. In working-class districts, water was shared like destiny. Public wells served hundreds. Communal barrels were touched by countless hands. There was no choice, only necessity. Thirst didn't care about class, but the ability to escape the risk absolutely did. For the poor, every cup was a dangerous obligation. For the rich, it was merely an inconvenience. And the cruelest part was that both lived under the same industrial sky. The same smoke covered the city. The same river ran through every neighborhood. But while some could build barriers, others were forced to drink straight from the threat. So contaminated water became a symbol of inequality too. Not just a sanitation problem, but a brutal division of survival. Because in that century, even the chance to live depended on how much you could pay not to drink death. And that silent, profound social distance would become one of the inevitable pressures that finally pushed the world toward change. But history never stays frozen forever. Even the darkest centuries eventually produce cracks where transformation can seep in. Slowly, the daily horror stopped being accepted as an inevitable fate. Epidemics became too repetitive, deaths too numerous, cities too wealthy to keep rotting on top of their own contaminated rivers. The reaction began slowly. Investigations, timid reforms, engineers proposing underground sewer systems, doctors starting to suspect that the enemy wasn't bad air, but something inside the water itself. And then came the great turning points. Sanitation networks, public health laws, treatment stations, filtration, chlorination. The invisible finally gained a name. Life, not a sentence. But today, when we turn on a tap, almost no one thinks about it. Water falls clean, transparent, safe. As if it had always been that way. As if humanity had never spent centuries drinking danger, swallowing uncertainty, burying children because of something so simple. The past, however, still lingers not as nostalgia, but as a silent warning. Because there was a time when quenching thirst was an act of involuntary courage, a time when survival wasn't heroic, it was just enduring the everyday. And perhaps that is history's most brutal signature. Remembering that the modern world was built not only by inventions and progress, but by millions of ordinary lives who faced every single day dangers hidden inside the most basic things, even a glass of water. And now, the next video playing on your screen continues this historical immersion. See you there.